Greetings and salutations. I am at Darjeeling Zen, and I am responding to a response by Moira Kathleen, or at Moira Kathleen, which may be found at Unlearning Econ's WordPress blog, which you may find at unlearningeconomics.wordpress.com under the article "Libertarianism is an Ideology Built on Neoclassical Economics." And in part of Moira's reply, she says, "Government by consent means that government derives authority to act from the consent of the governed." And I would agree with Moira at the face of this statement. And I think we can transpose or paraphrase this statement to form an ethical test that would work fairly well, and I think which kind of shows the validity of the original statement. And I might paraphrase it as such. Quote, "Contract by consent means that contract derives its authority or legitimacy from the consent of the consenting parties," close quote. And I can agree with Moira this far as to the meaning of government by consent being legitimate. If government is by consent, then I could go along with the fact that it would be legitimate. But it is surprising that there would be, I think, in Moira's meaning of this sense, a hidden premise, I believe, contained in the reasoning that follows. And namely, this hidden premise, which I believe is here, is implicit in the thought, is that the people are considered as a whole unit of analysis, when I think, it's fairly obvious that groups of individuals as groups do not of themselves, as a collective groupthink, make choices or decisions. Only individuals act, because only individuals make choices, and only individuals have volition. Now, perhaps, there might be a failure to recognize this premise because it follows from a prior hidden premise, and that it would be that all individuals in a democracy have agreed or consented to be bound by the decision of the group. And under this premise, it would be easy to see why anyone might like to ignore the obvious non-consent of individuals when this kind of pops up as a matter of fact. For if we assume that they had already previously given their consent to, such a contract as democracy, then, when someone says, "I do not consent," well, we look at that in a slightly different way. However, such has never been the case, or at least I'm not aware of any case where we have any factual evidence to suppose that the decision to make certain decisions in a democratic process was ever unanimously agreed to by all parties to be affected by the decision. And really, for any kind of democratic process to be legitimate, it would have to have been agreed to unanimously. And as such, we really can't assume, like, the conservative impulse might be, that either the propriety of the democratic process nor the legitimacy of current structures of power, unless we can find that all individuals really have consented, unless there was unanimous consent from the very beginning. Consent of the governed, it appears to me, really must have one of two possible meanings. Either one, that consent of the governed means the consent of each individual to be governed. Or secondly, it means consent of the governed means the consent of the people considered as a whole and defined through some supposedly legitimate process. If Moira means this first definition, that consent of the governed means the consent of each individual, then I think this would mean that when any individual decides that they no longer consent, then that person is really no longer under any obligation of governance and would be free to live their lives unmolested from then on, without any kind of punishment or penalty, or without the artificially imposed suggestion that they should, move, or any other such nonsense. If this is what Moira means by consent of the governed, then I would applaud her for, her brave stand for ethics and integrity. But however, if we mean the second thing, that consent of the governed means consent of the people considered as a whole, then I think we have an innumerable amount of philosophical problems to overcome to approach anything near tenability with this latter second meaning. If we consider consent of the governed, meaning consent of the people as a whole, we could not admit the ability for individuals to consent to this governance, because that would create an obvious contradiction from the start. If the individual does not consent as evidenced by the expression "I object" or "I do not agree," then if they are to be governed, we cannot allow this second theory of consent to permit such expressions of non-consent into evidence, right? We must deny this expression of non-consent into evidence. We must instead, under the second meaning of consent of the governed, we must instead create a theoretical construct that says, well, they had already given their consent to this arrangement, and that such expressions are only expressions of a kind of buyer's remorse, wishing that they had not originally agreed to or consented to what can only be referred to, I think, as a contract. But the problem that we have with this contract is that we cannot produce it. Or rather, we cannot produce it in a way that evidences the individual's original consent to the contract by their signature or other such evidence, which would be under no threat of duress or threat of punishment. The Constitution, as such, would at best only bind those persons who had signed that contract, acknowledging their agreement and consent. It could in no way bind, any other person. For if it could, then I could create any kind of contract and bind any other person of my choosing to that contract by the mere assertion that I represent them. So I fear that this contract upon which every bit of our second meaning of consent of the governed rests is a ghost, a fiction, a phantom of assumption. But let's go on. Let's say we could produce this agreement. What then? Well, even then, in the basics of, contract law, the contract must be made between equals, for their voluntary exchange. But our phantasm of contract, is no such thing. It is between one party that assumes the right to change the contract at will, to be the sole interpreter and judge of the contract, to allow no other third parties to arbitrate the contract. This would not be a contract between equals, even if we could produce the agreement. This is the pretension of contract between a ruler and the ruled, where the ruled are not full and equal parties who may freely consent or choose not to consent. And I would say that this position that I am espousing is a liberalism in its most consistent form, which avoids any such farce in our meaning of the word consent. Consent can only mean the consent of individuals at any time to agree or not to agree. To force someone to consent with the threat of punishment is an agreement under duress and would be considered so in every case, except with this one glaring exception, which, we traditionally permit. This is just because, we might have traditionalist or conservative impulses within us that says that the current forms of supposed governance must be legitimate, doesn't actually legitimate it. Just because it's old or has been or exists now doesn't legitimize, the ethical nature of the relationship. And, I would really challenge anyone who would contend that taxes are not collected by force or coercion to ask themselves, what if there were no punishment for the failure to pay any tax? Which is to say, what if each tax were made completely voluntarily on the part of the taxpayer, either the business or the person? If taxes are paid voluntarily, then we should see little to no reduction in our tax revenue, right? But of course, I don't think any of us are so naive to believe that if there was no threat of punishment, that people would continue to pay taxes. They might, of course, pay for some taxes, I guess, that they feel might benefit themselves in some way. But even then, why would they pay for the administration costs of taxation and redistributions to themselves for their own benefit? So Moira is very insistent that I answer two questions. The first: what does it mean for government to exist with the consent of the governed? And I believe I have answered this question, I think, at length. The consent of the governed must mean the consent of individuals, or it means mere rulership, hardly more sophisticated in its ethical premises than that of the pharaohs. However, on to Moira's second question. What are the most efficacious ways to make that agreed upon goal a reality? Close quote. Well, by now, I think my answer might be fairly obvious. The only way the consent of the governed is possible in any meaningful sense is for individuals to be allowed to withdraw their presumed and illegitimate consent at any time. If we wish to approach the problem even more honestly, we would, as individuals in the aggregate, which we might call society, demand that all interactions between persons be voluntary and consensual at all times. That the initiators of aggression in the form of force, violence, coercion, extortion, and theft, to include fraud, be absolutely shunned, and allow individuals to meaningfully consent to participate in the aggregate of individuals. This has been Darjeeling Zen, and thank you for watching.